Nebraska, late 2024. The cutting wind sweeps across the plains as a desperate widow, Rachel, collapses from hunger at the edge of a solitary farmer's land, her young son Caleb watching in terror. William Carter, a man locked in his quiet solitude, sees them from his window, never imagining that this single act of intervention will irrevocably change his isolated world. But before we begin this gripping tale of hardship and redemption, subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. And remember, tomorrow, there's a special story waiting for you. The cutting wind of Nebraska swept the arid fields at the end of 2024, carrying the smell of snow and the crushing weight of despair. Rachel Evans, only 37 years old but feeling ancestrally tired, tightened the threadbare coat around her frail figure, her gaze fixed on the infinite and indifferent horizon. At her side, Caleb, 8 years old, stumbled, his small hand lost in hers, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Hunger gnawed at them relentlessly, a constant pain that mirrored the void left by her husband's death and the subsequent evaporation of their cleaning jobs. The rented trailer, parked kilometers behind, offered little more than shelter. Food had become an inaccessible luxury, and the threat of eviction hovered like the darkening winter sky. Hope had reduced itself to a single desperate ember. Reach the farm ahead, which they said belonged to a solitary man, and beg for any crumb of work, any piece of food. Each step was an agony, legs heavy as lead, vision blurred. The farmhouse shimmered in the distance, a cruel mirage of warmth and sustenance. The last meters seemed like kilometers. When they reached the edge of the property, the world tilted violently. Her last reserves of strength abandoned her, the cold ground rushing up to meet her as darkness consumed her consciousness. Caleb's terrified screams were the last sound she heard, a painful echo of shared despair, left unanswered on the frozen land. Inside the sturdy farmhouse, William Carter, a man marked by the solitude of 44 years and the pragmatism of a life lived by the land, observed the scene through the window. He was a man accustomed to the tranquil rhythm of his own company, to the predictable cycles of planting and harvest, to the comfortable barrier he maintained between himself and the complexities of others' lives. However, the sight of the woman collapsing, of the boy crying beside her motionless form, shattered his practiced detachment. A fierce and unknown urgency pulsed through him. This was not just hardship. It was raw survival unfolding on his doorstep. Ignoring the ingrained habit of keeping to himself, he went out the door, his long strides devouring the distance. He reached them quickly, taking Rachel's disturbingly light body into his arms, her head lolling against his shoulder. He guided Caleb, stunned and tear-streaked, towards the house, his voice rough but firm, offering a reassurance he rarely expressed. "It's all right, boy. Let's go inside. Your mother will be okay." The words sounded strange even to him, an improvised balm for the boy's palpable fear. In the warmth of his kitchen, he gently laid Rachel on the worn sofa, checking her weak but present pulse. He covered her with a thick, heavy blanket. He turned to Caleb, his initial reserve softening slightly before the boy's wide, frightened eyes. "Sit here," he said, indicating a chair at the solid wood table. "I'll prepare something warm." Without waiting for a response, he began preparing simple food: hot broth, bread, the basic comforts his isolated life still provided. The smell of chicken broth filled the tense silence. As mother and son began to recover, nestled in the unexpected sanctuary, William watched them from a distance, near the wood stove that crackled softly. A storm of concern, curiosity, and a strange, unsettling disruption to his solitary existence brewed within him. He was not accustomed to this invasion, to this sudden, raw need in his carefully controlled space. But the image of her falling, the boy's helpless cry, something in him had changed in that frozen instant. He gave a steaming bowl of broth to Caleb, who held it with trembling hands. "Eat slowly," he instructed, his voice still a bit rough but lacking its usual harshness. Rachel emerged from the depths of unconsciousness, to the unfamiliar smell of wood smoke and simmering broth. Panic flared briefly before settling into profound relief upon seeing Caleb, safe and sound, hesitantly sipping soup at a sturdy wooden table. A man stood near the stove, his back to her, the farmer. William turned, his expression unreadable, but not hostile. His eyes, a deep blue like the winter sky outside, met hers. There were lines at the corners, etched by sun, and perhaps unspoken worries. "You fainted," he said, his voice a calm, direct baritone. "I saw from the window, brought you inside." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I don't usually get involved, but I couldn't just leave you out there," he explained, his presence, his intervention, with a frankness bordering on gruffness, admitting he wasn't one to interfere but couldn't turn his back. His words were sparse, but his actions, the blanket covering her, the food warming her son, spoke volumes. Overwhelmed by a gratitude so potent it brought fresh tears to her eyes, Rachel found herself recounting the harrowing path that had led her to his door, the sudden loss of her husband to a heart attack months earlier, the cleaning work that dried up when the small local business closed, the creeping tentacles of poverty and hunger tightening their grip. She spoke of the shame that kept her from asking for help, the stubbornness that made her believe she could manage alone, until there was absolutely nothing left. Her voice trembled, thick with unshed grief and the raw vulnerability of her situation. We had nowhere else to go," she whispered, her gaze fixed on her clasped hands in her lap. "I just wanted to ask for any work, cleaning, cooking, anything, for a little food." The confession came out in a thread of a voice laden with humiliation and desperation. William listened, his usual reserved countenance visibly thawing. He didn't interrupt, just nodded occasionally, his eyes fixed on hers, then on Caleb, who now watched him with a mixture of fear and childish curiosity. He saw beyond the hardship, to the willpower deep in her eyes, the unwavering love for her son that had kept her moving even when her body failed. He saw the dignity she fought to maintain, even in the deepest destitution. He found himself unexpectedly moved by her resilience, a quiet respect blooming in the space between them. He was not a man given to sentimentality, but her story, told with such painful honesty, resonated somewhere deep within his self-imposed solitude. Meanwhile, Caleb, drawn by a child's innate curiosity and perhaps the unexpected safety of the environment, began to cautiously venture around the unfamiliar surroundings of the kitchen and adjacent living room. His small fingers traced the patterns on the worn wood of the table, his eyes examining the few dusty photographs on a shelf, landscapes, an old dog, but none of people. His exploration eventually led him to the back door and, with a hesitant glance at William, who nodded almost imperceptibly, he stepped out into the thinly snow-covered yard, his eyes widening at the sight of the large red barn in the distance. A tentative glimmer of childhood energy returned, a spark in the stillness that enveloped the farm. Seeing the boy take a few hesitant steps in the snow, then look back with a mixture of excitement and uncertainty, the rarest sight appeared on William's stoic face, a small, hesitant smile. It was fleeting, almost a muscle twitch, but it was there, a crack in the facade of reserve. The initial cautious sanctuary offered by William soon deepened into something more profound. The following days were a delicate dance of coexistence. Rachel, quickly regaining her strength with rest and regular food, insisted on helping, cleaning the kitchen immaculately, mending a loose seam on the curtain, offering to cook simple but nourishing meals from the supplies William had. He accepted her help with an initial reluctance that gradually gave way to quiet appreciation. He found himself drawn not just to Rachel's plight, but to the quiet strength she radiated, even in her vulnerability, to the fierce maternal love that defined her. He watched the way she spoke to Caleb with infinite patience, even when worry shadowed her eyes. He watched the quiet efficiency with which she moved about the house, bringing a subtle order to spaces he barely noticed. The days turned into a week. The snow began to melt slightly under a pale winter sun. Their presence, which had initially felt like a jarring intrusion, began to feel normal. The silence of the house was no longer empty, but filled with the soft murmurs of Rachel, reading to Caleb at night, or the sound of the boy's hesitant footsteps exploring the safe bounds of the property. The farmer, acting on an impulse that surprised even himself, made an offer that went far beyond temporary shelter. One evening, as they shared a simple meal of stew and homemade bread, which Rachel had insisted on baking, he cleared his throat. "Rachel," he began, his voice a little rougher than usual. "I've been thinking." He looked down at his own large, calloused hands on the table. "There's work here, more than I can handle alone, especially with the thaw coming. The house needs tending. The spring garden needs preparing." He paused, meeting her gaze. "If you want, you and Caleb can stay. I can pay you a fair wage for work in the house and helping on the farm. There's a spare room upstairs. It's small but warm." The offer hung in the air, laden with unexpected generosity. It was a lifeline, a path to stability they hadn't known in months, maybe years. Rachel's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of overwhelming relief. "William, I don't know what to say," she stammered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've already done so much." "It's a practical offer," he said quickly, almost defensively, uncomfortable with her emotion. "I need help. You need a place. It makes sense." But they both knew it was more than that. As Rachel hesitantly accepted, gratitude making it hard to find the right words, and began settling into the rhythms of farm life, a genuine bond began to form between William and Caleb. Shared tasks, feeding the chickens clucking in there, run, checking the fences that delineated the vast fields, the simple wonder of watching the first green shoots emerge in William's heated greenhouse, bridge the gap between the reserved man and the curious boy. William taught Caleb how to identify animal tracks in the mud, the difference between wheat and barley growing in small test plots, how to fix a loose gate latch. The boy absorbed everything with wide eyes, his initial shyness fading, replaced by a growing admiration for the quiet man who knew so much about the world around him. The farm, once silent, now echoed with Caleb's incessant questions and occasionally his clear laughter, a sound that seemed to warm the cold corners of the property and William's heart. William, in turn, found himself slowly opening up, sharing fragments of his own solitary existence in response to Caleb's innocent questions or Rachel's observant comments. He spoke about his parents, who had worked this same land before him, about the decision to carry on the legacy, about the quiet solitude he had accepted as part of life, but which now, in their presence, he recognized as a loneliness he hadn't fully realized until their arrival. "It's quiet here," he admitted one evening, looking out the window into the darkness outside. "Sometimes too quiet." Inspired by Rachel's story and the palpable need he now saw firsthand, not just in her situation, but in the undertones of conversations he overheard when he went into the small nearby town for supplies, he quietly began setting aside portions of his stored harvest, sacks of potatoes, dried beans, jars of preserves from the previous summer. He made discreet trips at night to the local food bank, leaving the donations anonymously on the drop-off platform, never seeking recognition. It was a small but significant action, a reflection of the change occurring within him. Just as a fragile sense of peace began to settle, crisis erupted. The owner of Rachel's abandoned trailer, a rough man named Henderson, somehow tracked her down. He showed up at the farm one windy afternoon, his old loud pickup truck spewing smoke onto William's neat yard. His demands were harsh and threatening, demanding immediate payment of back rent and an exorbitant fee for the removal and storage of the dilapidated trailer, threatening to call the authorities to make a scene. Rachel turned pale, fear returning in full force. Before she could say anything, William, who had been fixing equipment in the barn and heard the noisy arrival, appeared. He stood between Henderson and Rachel, a solid, uncompromising presence. He didn't raise his voice, but there was a firmness in his gaze and posture that made Henderson falter. "What's the problem here?" William asked, his voice low and level. Henderson, slightly intimidated but still aggressive, repeated his demands, gesturing towards Rachel. "She owes me money, a lot of money, and if she doesn't pay, I'll make sure she has trouble." Without hesitation, William intervened. He didn't argue, didn't negotiate aggressively. He simply asked the total amount Henderson claimed was owed. After a moment of quiet assessment, he went inside the house and returned with a wad of bills. He counted the money into Henderson's hand, demanding a written receipt then and there, stating the debt was paid in full. But he went further. "And the trailer?" William asked. Henderson named a paltry sum. William paid it, buying the dilapidated trailer on the spot. "Consider it sold. Don't bother her again," William said, his tone final. Henderson, surprised by the swift resolution and the unexpected cash, mumbled something and drove off, leaving a tense silence behind. Later, William quietly arranged for the trailer to be towed away and silently donated it to a local program that would refurbish it for another family in need. He never mentioned the cost or the effort to Rachel. News, however, travelled fast in the small community. Whispers and judgments began circulating in the nearby town about the widow and her son living with the reclusive farmer. At the general store, while buying seed, William overheard snide remarks from two women. He turned, his expression stern. "Rachel Evans is an honourable woman working hard on my farm," he said, his voice clear and firm, silencing the chatter immediately. "She and her son are welcome under my roof and deserve respect. I suggest you keep your assumptions to yourselves." His unequivocal public defence of Rachel's integrity ran through the town, effectively silencing most of the gossip. This quiet act of fierce protection solidified William's place in Rachel's life. It wasn't just gratitude she felt now. It was something deeper, more complex. It was respect for his innate decency, admiration for his quiet strength, and a growing, undeniable affection for the man who had, without fanfare, become her protector, her employer, and somehow, her friend. She saw it reflected in the growing warmth she found in his steady gaze when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way he now sought her and Caleb's company at the end of the day, sharing stories from the farm, or just sitting in comfortable silence while Caleb dozed on the sofa. The seed of a new life, planted in desperation, was beginning to set down strong, unexpected roots in that Nebraska soil. The seed of change planted by Rachel's arrival had taken deep root in William. Her struggle, her innate resilience, and the simple joy Caleb brought to the quiet farm had awakened a dormant part of him, a desire to connect and contribute beyond his own fence lines. He saw the quiet desperation in Rachel's story echoed in the struggles of other families in the area. Families he now saw with new eyes, grappling with the same uncertainties he had come to understand more intimately through her. He heard snippets of conversation in town, saw the worried faces at the food bank, where he continued his anonymous deliveries. The newfound empathy, born from his connection with Rachel and Caleb, coalesced into decisive action. At an impromptu community meeting, he called at the small local church, an act that surprised everyone who knew him as the reclusive Mr. Carter. William announced his plan. His usually reserved voice rang clear and convicted in the quiet space. "I have land," he said simply, looking out at the surprised faces of his neighbours. "More land than I need for myself. And I see there's need in our community." He outlined his vision. He was dedicating a significant portion of his fertile land near the main road to create a community garden. It would be a shared resource where anyone facing hardship could grow their own fresh food, learn from each other, share the harvest, and find mutual support. He would offer the land, access to water from his well, and his own farming knowledge to help get the project started. "We can work together," he concluded, "help each other through hard times." It was a bold move, born from a profound personal transformation, offering tangible hope and a path towards self-sufficiency and collaboration. The initial reaction was shock, followed by a murmur of approval and gratitude. But his transformation wasn't just communal. It was deeply personal. The farm, once a refuge for his solitude, now felt incomplete without Rachel and Caleb's steady presence. He looked at Rachel, no longer just as the survivor he had rescued from the cold, but as a partner whose quiet strength had inadvertently rescued him from his own emotional isolation. He saw the intelligence in her eyes, the kindness in her interactions, the way she cared not just for Caleb, but for him too, with small attentions that warmed his previously monotonous routine. He saw Caleb, running through the fields with newfound freedom, calling his name with a familiarity that filled a void he hadn't known existed. The boy already felt like a son in his heart. He saw a future he hadn't dared to imagine before, one filled not with silence, but with warmth, laughter, and shared purpose. One quiet evening, after Caleb was asleep upstairs, they sat on the front porch, watching the stars begin to emerge in the vast Nebraska sky. The air was milder, holding the promise of spring. William turned to Rachel, the quiet between them comfortable, yet charged with unspoken emotion. "Rachel," he began, his voice lower than usual, tinged with a vulnerability she'd never heard before. He took her hand, his rough fingers enveloping hers with surprising gentleness. "My life was, organized, predictable, empty, I realize now." He looked into her eyes, sincerity shining in his. "You two changed everything. You showed me what it means to care, what it means not to be alone." He took a deep breath. "I don't want to go back to how it was before. I want to build something together. I want this to be your home permanently. I want Caleb to grow up here, on this land." He squeezed her hand gently. "Rachel Evans, will you marry me?" He offered not just his name and his home, but the promise of a permanent family, a shared life built on the mutual respect they had cultivated and the love quietly blooming between them. Rachel looked into the eyes of the man whose quiet kindness had fundamentally altered her life, who had offered protection when she was most vulnerable, stability when all seemed lost, and was now offering his heart. She saw the undeniable truth of his goodness, the steadiness of his character. Trusting the solid foundation they had built together in those winter months, she nodded, tears of relief and happiness finally flowing freely, not from pain or fear, but from unexpected, profound joy. "Yes, William," she whispered, her voice thick. "Yes, I will." Their wedding was simple, held under the vast Nebraska sky on the farm that had become their sanctuary. The ceremony took place near the old apple tree in the yard, witnessed by a handful of neighbors who had embraced the community garden idea, and by a beaming Caleb, who stood proudly beside William, holding the makeshift rings on a small pillow. Rachel had sown. It wasn't an end to their trials, but a definitive beginning, the quiet formation of a family forged in adversity and cemented by compassion and mutual respect. They settled into their new life, the farmhouse now filled not with the silence of solitude, but with the easy rhythms of partnership and parenthood. There was the sound of Caleb asking homework questions at the kitchen table, while Rachel prepared dinner and William read the farm journal. There were the quiet evening conversations between husband and wife, sharing the small victories and worries of the day. There was the shared laughter over some antic of Caleb's or a funny mishap on the farm. Rachel, drawing strength from her own harrowing experiences, became the heart of the burgeoning community garden. She worked side by side with other families, offering not just practical help with planting, weeding, and harvesting, but also a compassionate ear and quiet encouragement to those walking the difficult path she had recently navigated. She understood the shame that came with need, the hesitation to ask for help. She shared tips on stretching food, simple recipes using the garden's bounty, and, most importantly, offered dignity and understanding. She transformed her own past pain into a source of strength and connection for the community, finding deep purpose in helping others find hope in the soil. William, no longer defined by solitude, discovered a profound sense of purpose and contentment he hadn't known was missing. The joy of watching Caleb thrive, the quiet partnership with Rachel, the visible success of the community garden, all filled his life with a richness he had never imagined. The farm, once just a place of solitary work and subsistence, became a hub of shared effort, growth, and burgeoning hope. The community garden flourished that spring and summer, a vibrant testament to the power of connection, generosity, and hard work. Rows of vegetables thrived under the Nebraska sun, tended by many hands. Families shared the abundant harvest, swapped recipes and support, forging stronger bonds on the land William had offered. It became a symbol of renewal, celebrated by the local people who saw in the unlikely union of William and Rachel, and the garden born from it, a powerful reminder that even in the harshest seasons, under the most indifferent skies, new beginnings are possible, and kindness, like a well-planted seed, can indeed take root and flourish. The farmhouse, once a bastion of isolation, was now a beacon of warmth and community, radiating the quiet promise of better days. All right, thank you so much for watching this story unfold. We journeyed through hardship and witnessed the quiet power of kindness blossoming into something truly life-changing for Rachel, Caleb, and William. If their story of resilience, transformation, and the unexpected finding of family resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up. It really helps support the channel and lets us know you appreciate this kind of content. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell so you don't miss our future stories, exploring the strength of the human spirit and the impact of connection. We'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. What part of their journey touched you the most? Was it William's initial act of kindness, Rachel's perseverance, or the growth of the community garden? Let us know below. Thanks again for spending your time with us. Until next time, take care and remember the difference compassion can make.